Hello, my name's Peter Barker. I'm a product manager for Adobe Forms. I work closely with customers and partners and internal stakeholders. And I'm here with my colleague, Sandra Timmer. Sandra, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Hello, my name is Sandra Timme. I've been the product manager for SAP Business Client, and now I'm supporting Peter with the Adobe Forms topic because there's a lot of additional work, such as helping our customers to migrate to the new cloud platform.
Thanks, Sandra. So this is Devtoberfest, and the topic is Adobe Forms. The title, SAP Forms by Adobe. And what we want to do today is give you an overview, an introduction to Adobe Forms. Sandra will be showing you a demo later on, and you have the opportunity to post any questions you have in the chat, and we'll answer them afterwards. So first of all, how do we want to split up this presentation? We've put it roughly into four sections: an introduction and overview for those of you not familiar with Adobe Forms, and for those who are familiar with Adobe Forms, it's a useful recap. Then we'll be getting to the cloud. SAP is the cloud company. It's totally strategic for us, and we'll be looking at the cloud product, SAP Forms Service by Adobe. Then we'll be looking at on-premise. There is already an on-premise solution called SAP Interactive Forms by Adobe. But in future, there will be a new on-premise solution. I've referred to it here as the local deployment option. We'll also refer to it as XSA, which is the underlying technology. Then there's further information, links to documentation, to SAP community, and hints for how you can find more information about Adobe Forms. So first of all, the introduction, an overview, very high level. What can you do with Adobe Forms? What are the benefits? What is it all about? There are two scenarios which are relevant nowadays. On the left-hand side is the main scenario, and that's forms printing. So these are classic read-only forms. They're not interactive, so the end user is not entering any data into the forms. They're static. What can you do with these forms? Well, you can print them, you can email them, you can fax them, and you can archive them. So the output is generally PDF, although it could be other output forms as well. You can also work with interactive forms. That's a minor scenario. We no longer support the online interactive forms where you need an Adobe plugin in the browser. But what you can do is create offline interactive forms, so you can enter data in the forms and the back end is updated with the data from the form at a later date. But we're going to be focusing mainly on forms printing because that's what most customers use it for. The solution, Adobe Forms, has been around for literally decades, and every year there are new features and new functions, and it's impossible to list all of them within the space of a lecture, and some of the details are probably relevant only for a small number of customers. But what I've tried to do here is list some of the main features of Adobe Forms and their associated benefits. A lot of these are answers to frequently asked questions. So for example, I'm often asked, is Adobe Forms, so SAP Interactive Forms by Adobe, which is the on-premise solution, or SAP Forms Service by Adobe, which is the cloud solution, are they pure SAP products? And the answer is yes. If you buy these products, you have a contract with SAP. We have a cooperation with Adobe, and the key component is the ADS, Adobe Document Service, and we get that from Adobe, but your contract is with SAP. So there's perfect integration with SAP design times and SAP run times. The interactive forms, for the record, are pre-fillable, so you can enter data which will save time and reduce the number of errors. Barcodes are very popular. Lots of customers use them. You can store data digitally, so names, addresses, and IDs. Digital signatures are supported, that improves security. You can archive the forms. There's a special format for that known as PDFA. There are various versions of that, and we try to support the most up-to-date versions as they come on stream. Archiving forms means they're available at a later date, along with the fonts that were used at the time. And that's obviously useful for compliance purposes. So when the auditor comes round or a tax inspector comes round, you can say, look, here's the original form, the way it looked. Here's evidence of the transaction. We use Adobe Reader as the front end. One advantage is that it's free of charge. Another advantage is everyone's familiar with it, so there's no training required. And forms are obviously electronic documents, so that has obvious benefits in regards to sustainability, and it reduces costs. You don't have large amounts of physical paper being stored or moved around the company, and you can access the forms in the space of seconds. There are also built-in syntax checks if you need them in forms, and that reduces the number of errors. So moving on, as I mentioned earlier, the current on-premise solution is SAP Interactive Forms by Adobe. The name is a bit of a mouthful and it's a bit misleading because the solution doesn't just cover interactive forms, it also covers print forms. And print forms, that's the scenario which most people use it for. Fewer and fewer people use forms interactively. Now, the licensing is complex. The main takeaway here is that print forms, which is what most customers use, are free of charge, even if you create new print forms. When you come to interactive forms, you may need a license. The interactive forms that SAP deploys with its solutions are free of charge, and if you make minor changes to them, they're free of charge. But as soon as you make non-cosmetic changes, as soon as you create your own interactive forms, you need a license. Going back to the print forms, although I said they're free of charge in the sense that you don't need to buy a license, in effect you do incur costs because you need hardware, you need to employ someone to install the ADS, it needs to be updated, you may want to post error messages, customer messages, you need to deal with things like load balancing and sizing. So there is a certain amount of work which has to be done, and so there are indirect costs. Moving on, there are legacy solutions for forms known as SAP Script and Smart Forms. And we understand that there are still a lot of customers who use them. It's a mature technology. We no longer invest in it. We no longer provide new functionality. We just do bug fixing. That's all. As far as support is concerned, it will be maintained as long as the platforms on which it runs. So it runs on S4HANA. S4HANA is supported until 2040. So obviously we have to support SAP Script and Smart Forms until then. But if you're creating new forms, or if you're overhauling your forms landscape, then we very strongly recommend that you move to Adobe Forms. It's the standard forms technology. There's no successor to it on the horizon. You can use it for print forms and offline interactive forms. It uses state-of-the-art technology like Adobe Reader for reading the forms, for displaying them, Lifecycle Designer for designing the forms, and Adobe Document Services for rendering the forms. There's lots of new functionality. There's all sorts of things you can do with Adobe Forms that you can't do with SAP Script. So it supports graphical elements, it supports PDFA for archiving, just as two examples. And we have a very rich partner ecosystem. We have lots of partners out there who fill in the white spaces. So if there's missing functionality, or if there's an extra tool that could be created to make things a bit easier, to facilitate things, then there's usually a partner out there who has done it or can do it or can provide some sort of support. Okay, now we get to the second chapter, the main block, I would say, and that's cloud. SAP is the cloud company, and the product here is called SAP Forms Service by Adobe. So what are the benefits and what is it? First of all, what is it? It's the ADS in the cloud. So this main rendering component that generates the forms, that's in the cloud. Okay. The advantages are you don't have to install the ADS. We do it. You don't have to patch it. We do it. You don't have to do with updates. We do it. You always have the latest version of the ADS. You don't need to buy extra hardware. We do it. If you need reader rights or credentials for the interactive forms, we do that as well. When it comes to sizing, load balancing, hardware setup, we do it. So that's where you save money, as it were. The licensing model is different. We'll see that on the next slide. And a lot of things remain the same. So nothing changes for the form designer, nothing changes for the end user. The end user doesn't know where the ADS is, so the functionality is still the same. And it can be used by cloud customers in the sense of customers who are only in the cloud. That's a very small minority. Or by customers who are on-premise. Just because your application is on-premise, it doesn't mean the ADS has to be on-premise. The ADS can be in the cloud. So licensing, I mentioned, is different. So forget the licensing for on-premise. For SAP Forms Service by Adobe, the main concept is that of a billable request. So when you send a technical request to the ADS to generate a form, it also involves a billable request. But a billable request is not quite the same as a technical request. So if I send one technical request to generate a PDF comprising 25 pages, that is 5 billable requests, because 5 pages is one billable request. If you set a digital signature, it's a billable request. If you do a print preview, it's a billable request. And we don't distinguish between interactive and print forms because they both generate a load on the ADS. We don't distinguish between system type. So whether you're dealing with a quality system or a productive system or a development system, it still generates a load on the ADS, and so it costs money. The licensing options can be found in the Discovery Center. The cheapest one is known as BTP EA, BTP Enterprise Agreement. There's another option which is a bit more flexible, but generally more expensive, known as pay-as-you-go. And you can ask your account executive for details about that, but you can read up on it in the Discovery Center. A couple of concepts I'd like to talk about. Here, general background. One of them is availability zones. And this is obviously relevant to the cloud. An availability zone is a single failure zone in a single geographical region. So for example, in Frankfurt, there'll be several availability zones. Each zone has its own independent power supply, its network, and cooling facilities. And if one of these availability zones goes down, there's another one there that can pick up the slack. Now, this isn't a form-specific function. This is something that we inherit from BTP. And there are a lot of features and functions where we benefit from general functionality that we get from BTP. In terms of data locations, this slide is just very schematic to indicate that we have data locations all over the world. We have a lot more than you can see on this slide. We have some in the US, in Frankfurt, Japan. We're adding locations all the time. And you can see which locations are currently supported in the documentation. There's a link to the documentation later on. We're often also asked about service level agreements. You know, what is support like? What is availability like? And again, we inherit it from BTP. With BTP, the service levels are 99.9%. So that's an important point. Mass printing. What we mean by mass printing is if you're printing large numbers of documents in a short space of time. So there's certain branches, certain sectors which have mass printing scenarios, so utilities or the automotive sector, where lots and lots of invoices are being printed, say at the end of a month or an end of a quarter or the end of the year. And the question that customers ask themselves, obviously, is can the ADS do it? And that's always been a question, even when ADS was on premise, but it's also a question for the cloud. And we very, very strongly recommend, if you have a mass printing scenario, or if you think you might have a mass printing scenario, then do a proof of concept. Test it yourself with your own hardware, and most importantly, with your own templates, and then you can see whether the mass printing scenario will work or not. Another general point is security. It's always an issue, especially in the cloud. So I've collected up a few items of information here. We have done internal and external security tests. Another answer to a frequently asked question is that SAP Form Service does not store rendered documents in the cloud. So we don't store your personal data anywhere in the cloud. All customer data is completely segregated and invisible to other customers. I've now got a couple of slides about scenarios. One scenario is a pure cloud scenario. Near the top of the slide in the middle, you can see form service. That's the ADS in the cloud. And right at the bottom of the slide, you can see the ABAP application, also in the cloud, running on ABAP environment. So this is an ABAP scenario on BTP, where the application is running within ABAP environment. The more common scenario is with SAP S/4HANA on-premise. So again, near the top of the slide in the middle, there's the form service, the ADS in the cloud. But this time, the ABAP application is at the bottom. That's on-premise, on SAP S/4HANA on-premise. And the two worlds, as it were, are connected to one another by means of the cloud connector. A final scenario is for customers who say, look, we don't have an ABAP backend at all. We're purely in the cloud, and we have a Java application, or we have a Fiori app, and we still want to use the ADS. And so here you have the ADS as it was before in the cloud, and you have a cloud application that talks to the ADS via a REST API. So the key point here is that we now have a REST API available. There are two different platforms you might hear about. One of them is called Neo and the other is Cloud Foundry. And of course, there's on-premise as well. So I've created a table here comparing them. On the left-hand side, there's SAP NetWeaver ADS AS Java. That's the on-premise solution. In the middle, there's Neo. Neo means new, but unfortunately, in this case, it's the old solution, the old cloud solution. There are some customers who are still on Neo. There are a very small number of customers who have to be on Neo because something is not yet supported on Cloud Foundry. But the new go-to platform for the vast majority of customers is Cloud Foundry on the right-hand side. That's what we recommend. One advantage is that it's a bit cheaper. So the package size, the minimum package size of form requests, 1,000 rather than 10,000. So that's an advantage. And in both cases, in the cloud, you get up to 200,000 form requests per month free of charge. Okay, and that's a really important point. You only start paying if you use more than 200,000 form requests per month. Okay. Now we move on to the demo. So I'll hand over to Sandra. Would you like to take control and show your demo?
Yes, sure. So I'll try to share. I'd like to give you a glimpse into the SAP Forms service by Adobe on BTP, Business Technology Platform. To consume the print service on Cloud Foundry, you need to create your own SAP account with the appropriate subscriptions. Here, the Forms service by Adobe, of course. You have to create an instance to access the service from external systems. And using the Forms service by Adobe API, as Peter already mentioned, with the service key, you can access the central Adobe Form template storage as well. So yeah, that's the key. I'll open the application to show you the new landing page where you can find the configuration, the template store, and the API documentation. And take a look at the setup. This is where you can upload your custom fonts, for example. And yeah, you can see the Adobe fonts as well, but you can upload your own fonts. Just to get a little feeling for how it looks like in BTP. This is the template storage, where you can organize your templates. The template storage, the templates are stored directly on BTP, so you can access them by multiple systems. And this is just a very short look on the API documentation. And yeah, to find out more regarding the demo and the whole ABAP cloud scenario, please take a look at the blog post by Pascal Prima and the documentation as well. And don't miss the DevToberfest session by our colleague André Fischer on the 21st of October on the reuse services in ABAP Cloud. He'll show the pin service in a typical ABAP Cloud scenario. And all the links you need for that are included in this presentation. Thanks.
Okay, moving on to the next slide, on-premise local deployment option. I mentioned earlier that there's going to be a new on-premise solution, sometimes referred to as the local deployment option, but we'll be seeing some other names for it on the next slide. And this is a really key slide about the ADS maintenance strategy. So going through it, as we've already announced, NetWeave Application Server Java goes out of mainstream maintenance at the end of 2027. There's extended maintenance until the end of 2030. And after 2030, there'll be no further updates. So that's a key point. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to replace things with what's known as, take a deep breath, SAP HANA Extended Application Services Advanced Model XSA. Now, the key term here is XSA. This is the other name that we use for the local deployment option. This is what we'll be using in future for ADS for customers who want to stay on premise. Now, as far as the timing's concerned, it'll probably happen during the support timeframe of S/4HANA 2025. That doesn't mean the year 2025. It'll probably be later than that, but during that release timescale. And basically, it guarantees there'll be long-term support for Adobe functionality on premise. Internally, we use the ADS on BTP for SAP S/4HANA Public Cloud Edition, and it's the recommendation for the private edition as well. So moving on to further information, here is the roadmap. I won't go into detail on each and every point here, but I'll pick up on a few key points. And one question that often comes up is about data centers. So on the left-hand side, the recent innovations, you can see some of the data centers we already support. If you look in the documentation, you can see that's out of date. We support more than that now. There's some other detailed innovations that we've provided for SAP S/4HANA as well. In 2024, this is this year, there are a lot of things we've already done here, a lot of continuous improvements, support for additional data centers, and a free tier offerings. You can try out the solution as well, and various new features for the output control for S/4HANA. And looking forward to 2025, we're going to provide support for Cloud Foundry on Google Cloud Platform, and there will be continuous improvements, for example, adding additional regions in Cloud Foundry as well. So moving on, further information, you can see links to SAP community, you can see links to documentation. So in particular, the documentation on SAP Forms Service by Adobe on Cloud Foundry is highly recommended. The final link is to an FAQ about SAP Forms Service by Adobe on Cloud Foundry. That's part of the documentation as well. There's lots of information there that's worth looking at too. Finally, thank you very much for your attention, and just a reminder that you can post any questions in the chat. We look forward to those questions and we'll try and answer them as best we can. So thank you very much, and it's goodbye from me, Peter Barker.
Goodbye.